I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your big brother superfan and co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I am your floater for the summer and co-host, Dean Detloff.
Grab a life vest, Dean. Floaters, go home. We're going to talk about imperialism in this episode. We're going to talk about imperialism and coups and the rhetoric that Christians have developed around imperialism. But before we do, a new season of Big Brother just started.
But first.
Hashtag but first. New season of Big Brother just started, and we got to talk about it. Dean, American Big Brother, United States Big Brother, it's always contentious. It's not as good as Canadian Big Brother. We all know this. Who are your faves? Who do you want to see win?
All right, dang. Yeah, this is content that I'm sure appeals to our entire pool of listeners, but I'm here for it. This is our podcast, and guess what? You're listening to it. So you're just going to have to deal with it. I think, all right. My favorite right now is a guy named Michael. He rules. He's a lawyer. He seems very kind and also very smart, and that's what you want in a good Big Brother fave.
I agree. Michael's my fave. He's also my wife's fave. He's on my fantasy Big Brother team, which is great. Great for me. The thing about Michael that's good is that he got singled out really quick at the very beginning because he was a super fan. But then he won the power of veto, and then he did pretty well in this competition that they did on Thursday. So things are looking good. I like Michael a lot. I also like there's a guy named Monty who's really great, and there's a football coach who I don't like, but I kind of am secretly rooting for, and his name is Pooch. And listen, I think that they're going to go pretty far in the game.
I think you're probably right. All right, if you've never watched Big Brother, you are missing out. That's what I'm going to say. And we are going to get to imperialism for sure in a minute. But one great thing about Big Brother is it is an incredible microcosm of everything that is happening in the country where that particular version of Big Brother happens to be playing. And it's amazing to watch specifically a season of Big Brother US and a season of Big Brother Canada. Man, just a great reflection of two societies and what they expect out of their reality TV. It's a really wild summer right now, in particular in US Big Brother. In some ways I don't particularly like, but you know what? If you're gonna watch one reality show, and if you need to commit to 3 hours of TV a week right now in your life, let it be Big Brother. You can interact with us on Twitter. We'll get pumped about it.
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. Big Brother is, you're right. They do reflect what's going on in either country. Canadian Big Brother, it's always got a handful of sort of like queer and like non-gender conforming people on it, and Indigenous people, and it's very interesting for those reasons. And then U.S. Big Brother is like a train wreck, an absolute train wreck in every way. They pick like lots of like social media influencers who have some redeeming qualities, but not very many.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess. It's a mess, but I do love it. I don't, the reason I got into Big Brother was because of my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time. She was really into it, and I was like too good for reality TV. And I said, I'm never going to watch this show. I'm sure the show is bad because reality TV is bad. I was a good like Christian dropping out of society kind of guy. And by good, I mean extremely annoying. And
Yeah.
she was like, I don't care. I'm going to watch the show because I love it. And so eventually I was like, all right, whatever. I'll watch it because I love you specifically. And now I am glad to say I was completely wrong. I love it unironically. It has become a show that I like on my own, and I'm always singing its praises, spreading the good news. So if you too think you're too good for reality TV, guess what? You're not. Your reality TV is out there just waiting for you to appreciate how good it is.
Something I remember from my time in my master's degree in grad school, when I had classes with a friend of the show, Richard Gilmapolsky, a guy who I love very dearly. He would a lot of times come to class and tell us that he was watching, whatever trashy TV show. It's great because it gave me permission to not be too high-minded about myself, not to take myself too seriously. Of course, I'm going to read a lot of French philosophy, but then you can stop and then go read, and you can go watch Big Brother and Survivor and every other bad show. So this is your permission to do that if you needed it. You probably don't, but just saying, it's here.
That's
It's
right.
here if you want it.
It's here if you want it, and you might not even know that you want it. All right, let's talk about imperialism. Speaking of U.S. media that that finds its way into other countries, we talk on this podcast a lot about imperialism. In fact, we've done a handful of essays. Whoa, sometimes I feel that way. A handful of episodes on it in the past, and we've talked about what Marx thinks about it, what Lenin thinks about it, what all your faves and people you don't like think about it. And I think it is something that at least I find myself thinking about a lot because it shows up in all these weird ways, imperialism, right? It shows up in theory, but it also shows up in the news, or you kind of hear like a strange sort of like candid moment where a politician lets something out on TV. We'll talk about that in a minute. But lots of kind of, I guess, excuses to think about imperialism. And I am constantly thinking about it too, because when you're thinking about things like global solidarity, you can't really get around it, right? So when we talk about things like U.S. hegemony or other Western meddling in nations around the planet, it can seem like sort of a big unstoppable system of oppression and degradation. And there's even a big kind of ideological term that dresses it up these days. People talk about defending a rules-based international order. And the question is always whose rules, which order. It looks like disorder to a lot of people, right? So the assumption is that it's maybe not the United States in particular that's pulling all the strings, but there's this global society that values some things over other things, right? Like there's this kind of value for law, value for rules, but in fact, those rules and laws always come back to defend capitalism against other stuff. And there's ways on the left that people talk about this that are helpful. There are also some other confusions around the left. It's a contested term, imperialism, especially these days. And Christians also have a special interest in imperialism, talking about empire and all that kind of stuff. So we thought, why not take a minute this week and come back to the heart of worship, come back to the heart of this podcast, and talk about imperialism. We're going to get down to it. And it was inspired by one particular moment on TV that, Matt, maybe I'll let you introduce and talk about.
Yeah, for sure. If this podcast talks about, if there is a heart of worship of this podcast, it's talking about violence, it's talking about imperialism, and then also having really rough segues from talking about Big Brother to talking about whatever else is going on.
From Big Brother to the other Big Brother.
That's right, the Big Brother of the rules-based international order. So, like you're saying, Dean, like capitalists do, go through a lot of trouble to kind of like keep the illusion that there is no such thing as imperialism. Instead, that they are just, all players in a big global game of risk. There's an illusion where, the United States is not leading the world around by the nose. There's all these other planetary governing bodies like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or, the UN or whatever, right? There's all of these kinds of things that exist in the world that try to direct us towards thinking that the United States is just one country among many. And in a lot of ways, that's true. The U.S. is one country among many, but it's too far of a stretch to believe that like some countries don't have a bigger pull over the others in the world, or that some countries don't set the rules where others have to follow. So I think that we saw a little bit of this happen directly in the last week when everyone's least favorite person in the world, John Bolton, who is a former White House National Security Advisor and also a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He said some very goofy stuff.
He looks like a Scooby-Doo. He also looks the part, I think.
He does. He has a big mustache, and I think probably spends most of his day sitting in a big chair, petting his cat, thinking about how he's going to overthrow, I don't know,
But he's like you,
Lula in Brazil or whatever.
Yeah, you take off the big gorilla mask at the end, and there he is, John Bolton, the guy with glasses and a big mustache, who looks like he should be, I don't know, wandering around the amusement park.
Yeah, that's right. So John Bolton this past week, he was being interviewed by Jake Tapper. Who cares about him? Anyways, Bolton was in a very roundabout way defending Trump about what has been going on during the January 6th hearings. So Jake Tapper starts asking Bolton some questions about whether or not he thinks like Donald Trump is like competent enough to pull off a coup, which is a very funny question to begin with. And Tapper says that, you don't have to be a brilliant person to pull off a coup. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to overthrow a country. And like, this is a very funny thing because John Bolton becomes like kind of incensed at it. Like, he's like, wait a minute now, kind of feeling like this might be like an insult to his own intelligence, because as he reveals on TV, John Bolton knows a thing or two about coups because he's actually done them, right? So he says like, I wouldn't say that you don't have to be a genius because I've been a part of them. You have to be pretty competent. And it's like, come on, man. It's really, really embarrassing, I guess. A really embarrassing thing just to say. I mean, it's like, it's silly that, everyone knows that John Bolton is kind of, he's an imperialist dirtbag, right? He's been doing this kind of thing for a long time. He was really involved in the attempted coup with Juan Guaido in Venezuela. So it's just like we know these things about him for sure, but then he goes just on TV just to say the quiet part loud or whatever, and it just seems like this extremely silly moment on TV. But I guess what's interesting about Bolton's statement is that it reveals, what's true about the rules-based international order, right? The truth is that it's like just a fabrication that people use to cover up old-fashioned imperialism. People come up with all kinds of, this is like what Dean was saying a minute ago, people come up with all kinds of ways to sort of dress up imperialism or put forth new ideas about how international order works and the ways that maybe governments are superseded by capital in their entirety, which is an idea we'll talk about in a little bit. But like, it is, at the end of the day, true in some ways, but also drastically untrue in many others, right? So sure, there are some big organizations like the IMF or the World Bank or whatever, and they exist and they do things, and that's totally true. But it's also not like every country has the same access to directing those organizations as the U.S. and its allies do, right? It's not like the U.S. and Venezuela or the U.S. and Cuba or the U.S. and, like Ecuador or whatever are on the same playing field when it comes to the UN or the IMF or whatever. So I think in light of all of this silliness and like media spectacle, we're going to talk about why it's actually really important to know some of the specifics about imperialism and how it works. And we're also going to kind of give some special space in this episode to talk about the ways that Christians have understood and like failed to understand imperialism, and maybe like why it really matters that we understand it in more of a rigorous way rather than just sort of a rhetorically powerful way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one thing that maybe we can add in this episode that we haven't talked about as much in other episodes, although we have kind of addressed obliquely, is really drilling into that idea of the rules-based international order. What does it mean to use that kind of phrase in a world where the game is rigged, right? Like the order is very obvious kind of who benefits from it. And the rules that apply in some countries don't apply in many others. So I think it'll help us to maybe work backwards into some of the theory here, starting with things like John Bolton, and maybe I'll pick a couple of other examples too. The thing I always like to say, and what I used to say in a handful of like settings and stuff like that when we talk about imperialism, is that you can have all the theory and you should have the theory, but it helps to have really specific examples, like to look at particular countries. And there are lots of historical examples, some extremely obvious and egregious, right? Like the U.S. funding the Contras, fighting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or whatever, or Richard Nixon famously saying that after Allende was elected in Chile that he wanted to make the economy scream with sanctions. There's these really transparent kind of ways that coups and that kind of thing, that kind of imperialism is really on the nose. But these days, one thing that is true is that you can't seem to do that as directly, or at least it's not done as publicly And that gives the illusion that it's kind of not done at all, that this was a 20th century, a 19th century strategy of engaging in other countries by bullying them around more directly. But now, imperialism is either more sophisticated, or it's kind of like we don't really have imperialism anymore. We have soft power,
Right.
that's like a little gentler or something like that. Maybe still bad, but not the same. And I think it's important when we see examples like John Bolton saying something on TV like, oh no, I've been part of a coup, to then remind ourselves that actually there is a whole sort of theory among real political actors who have more power than most of us, that we are not out of the woods with those kinds of tactics. And so I think a lot about Bolton. For people who maybe haven't followed Bolton, and why would you? Congratulations. He, as Matt said, was working in the Trump administration, and he was hired on in the middle of the administration. I forget which year, but he wasn't there in the very beginning. He was brought in, and he had a history already of doing a lot of dirty international politics stuff in the past, in Reagan's administration. And he immediately went to work creating a kind of rhetorical device that he called the Troika of Tyranny between Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. That these were the three kind of problem children of, U.S. paternalist interests, and they needed to like whip them into shape or whatever. And there's a whole Canadian piece of this too. John Bolton found a super willing ally in Chrystia Freeland in particular, who was not exactly his counterpart in Canada, but like effectively, I guess, because the Canadian government is just different. But basically, yes. So there's kind of a lot of spillover effects. So you have John Bolton running around doing these things, right? Trying to like whip up a frenzy around these countries. And in the case of Venezuela, doing this bizarre strategy around Juan Guaido. If you ever want to read something really weird, Bolton put out a book about his time in the White House, and it is very funny and like an extremely unreliable narrator. So, take it all with a grain of salt. But there's a great chapter in it about Venezuela. And you have to really read between the lines. Like, Bolton is convinced that Cuba is, like, pulling all the strings in Venezuela as though they're the Soviet Union, kind of, like, out there with their spies, like, thwarting the U.S. at every turn. Which I'm sure Cuba has interest in Venezuela, but, like, I don't know. Maybe I'm underestimating Cuba, but probably not what Bolton thinks. Anyway, it's all very interesting to kind of read about some of the fractures in the White House around imperialism. One thing that comes out in it is that like Bolton and some other people in the administration really wanted to go hard on Venezuela, and they wanted to accomplish a coup like transparently. Like he tells you all the calls he's making and the kind of pieces he's trying to get on the board, and they fail in part because Donald Trump just like lost interest, I guess, in Venezuela, which good for them. I guess that is a strange kind of wrinkle in the divisions among the ruling class. But I guess I'm on this tangent about Bolton because when we think about specifics, it's helpful to be like, well, here's a person who was in a position of power who made an effort to pursue what some people might say is an outdated imperialist strategy. And maybe in some ways it's outdated insofar as like Donald Trump didn't care about it, and that kind of changes the rules of the game. But nevertheless, this is like a live discourse that's happening among the ruling elite still today in in the early 21st century.
It's true, and like you said, there's a lot of people kind of caught up in it. It's not just Bolton, but like other people too. It reminds me of this article from the Monthly Review that John Bellamy Foster wrote, I guess like about a year ago, in 2021. This issue of the Monthly Review has an essay in it called "The New Cold War in China," and that one, John Bellamy Foster, he wrote it. And anyways, he's trying to parse out, is the current situation or last summer's situation with China like a Cold War? Like, is that how you'd kind of characterize it, or is it something different? And the answer is really complicated because, sometimes yes, sometimes no. In some ways, the United States was like really willing to kind of like go along and like partner with China on some things, and then in other cases, they aren't. And it's really interesting because John Bellamy Foster, he kind of zeroes in on this rules-based order phrase that we were mentioning earlier, and how it's kind of a cover to sort of cover over like what's actually happening. And in the essay, he says this. He says that as China's indicated, if the rules-based order is set by the U.S. alone, then it cannot be called international rules, but rather hegemonic rules. And if it refers to the rules set by a U.S. and a handful of other countries, then it cannot be called international rules either, but rather clique rules, which run counter to the principle of democracy and won't be accepted in the majority of countries in the world. And I think that that's actually kind of a helpful way to parse out what happens with imperialism, because, there's like a temptation just to be like, well, the United States is like the worst country. It's like extremely strong and it can set all of these rules itself. But that's probably not exactly true, right? It's like, the United States has a lot of sway over the ways that quote unquote international rules are set. But it's actually, coalitions of sort of like Western governments, right? It's the United States, it's Europe, it's Canada, whatever, these kinds of countries. But I like the phrase clique rules, right? It helps kind of make sense of the ways that, it gives some texture even to the idea of imperialism, right? Imperialism can be like a complicated term, and like what exactly it means and like what countries are always behind it is sometimes sort of hard for people to parse out, because you have to follow international relations and you have to be like really well versed in that kind of thing in ways I definitely am not. But anyways, I like the phrase clique rules because it kind of helps us think through the ways that like international relations and imperialism are both projects of power and not just like neutral sort of world orders.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so I mentioned Canada was kind of wrapped up in this John Bolton scheme. And I always find that a really instructive example, because at the time of Donald Trump being in office, we have Justin Trudeau here in Canada, a liberal party.
Fidel Castro's son.
Fidel Castro's son, that's right. And, what's so interesting about it is, for all their differences or difference in rhetoric or style or flavor or whatever, they did not really differ on issues of foreign policy, which has not always been the case. Sometimes Canada has been willing to chart its own path, including, for instance, Pierre Trudeau, Justin's dad. When he was prime minister, he chose an independent stance toward Cuba that fell out of favor with the United States. And good for them. Interesting thing, cool thing. But not the kind of thing that Justin Trudeau's administration is doing now. And one thing that's really fascinating is, like, Canada had this desire, I think, to be seen as contributing to this international rules-based order. Canada's a weird country. It's always kind of nervous about its place on the world stage, it seems to be anyway. And so, for example, with, Bolton is out there trying to like stoke the fires of Guaido and so on. In Canada, they organized this thing called the Lima Group, which was named because they made it in Lima, Peru. And it's like literally a handful of governments in Latin America plus Canada that are explicitly organizing around how to like oust Maduro from power. And the kind of rhetoric that was always used to describe the Lima Group by Chrystia Freeland in particular, who is responsible for a lot of these international diplomacy kind of things, she would say that, Maduro doesn't play by the rules of an international rules-based order. But the wild thing is, like, the members of the Lima Group were people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? Or like Duque in Colombia. Rulers who also, even by liberal standards, did not play by the rules of international order, right? They, like, Bolsonaro stole the election. He had to throw Lula in jail to win, and was like trampling over the rights of all kinds of people to do it. And the same in Colombia. Duque was doing all kinds of really awful stuff and backing off the peace process, which was based on a referendum and so on. So it just kind of gives the lie, I guess, to these rules that are supposed to be out there. Clique rules is the right way to put it. Maduro doesn't fall into the clique. He's not willing to play by the rules of the U.S. I mean, love him or hate him, love Venezuela or don't love it. That's the problem. The problem is not that people do or don't like him. I'm sure that privately people don't like Bolsonaro either, but he's willing to play by the rules. He'll sit at your lunch table, and so they're fine to like invite him in. So it's important to see that how those rules play out and who they play out for.
I think that's right. I mean, whatever, I mentioned China a minute ago, and now we're talking about Venezuela, and it's like, we're not trying to like pass judgment on these places necessarily. I mean, maybe Venezuela more than China, but you don't necessarily have to do that to kind of like see the sort of hypocrisy in the clique rules of the world, and maybe how they're just like I don't know. They are extremely. They're stemming from power, not like actual rules based order whatsoever. When you're talking through that whole situation in Venezuela, Dean, I mean, here's a great example of it. This is kind of kicking up again too, so it's in the news headlines. But let's see. Venezuela is a country, like we were talking about, that John Bolton was involved in a coup, like I guess loosely or maybe not loosely. I don't know exactly how involved he was. Some people have said maybe he's less involved than he says, but whatever. It doesn't matter. In one way or another, he's involved. In the course of that coup, the plan was to get this other guy, Juan Guaido, to kind of like claim power and to be recognized as like the leader of Venezuela, right, on the international stage. That's what the United States wanted. That's what the UK wanted, and all these other countries. I mean, Canada as well. I don't want to forget Canada. Anyways, but something that's really interesting is that like since then, that has actually had some really big material problems for Venezuela. Like, I mean, all kinds of like sanctions and stuff for sure. And also a lot of other material problems on the ground. But one specifically very weird problem, the way that you can see the sort of click rules work out, is that there is $1.5 billion of Venezuelan gold stored at the Bank of England. And the drama here is that because of the dire financial straits of Venezuela, Maduro wants the $1.5 billion of gold, which I think makes a lot of sense. It's his gold and he wants it now. But the thing is that the UK is saying, sorry, you can't have this gold because we recognize Juan Guaido as like the leader of Venezuela, right? So this is I think a great example though of the ways that like there's an orchestration between Western powers to squash people they don't like, just kind of arbitrarily in a way of thinking. It's interesting though because there's been sort of an ongoing legal battle for Venezuela to get this gold back. But here's this is from Reuters that kind of encapsulates the situation. A long-running legal battle between Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and opposition leader Juan Guaido over who should hold the key to more than $1.5 billion of gold stored at the Bank of England resumed at the London High Court on Wednesday. So that was on July 13th, which is my birthday, which is a bad day to do this. But anyways, it's fine. So there's more than $1.5 billion of Venezuelan gold in the Bank of England. And now the UK Supreme Court is trying to figure out like what they should do. And I guess like that's a bonkers situation, right? Why does the UK Supreme Court have any say over what should happen to the gold of Venezuela? It's just like this completely strange discussion. Like, I don't know, if Dean, you gave me $10 and then all of a sudden I said like, sorry, that's not your money anymore or whatever. I don't know. It's in my pocket so I can decide whether or not you get it back. I don't know. That would not make any sense. That's like some real childish kind of stuff. Anyways, it's a great example though of how the click works. Some countries have access to the inner rules of the click of international order, and some do not.
Yeah, there's a lot of other weird things to that too. Like one court at some point, the details are lost to me now, but a court in the UK had ruled that the gold probably did belong to Maduro, or at least like Maduro was the sort of constitutionally elected leader. But there was a recognition that the foreign policy of the government did not think that, and so there was this bizarre discrepancy between like the legal definition of ownership and like the political situation involved. So I don't know, the whole thing is a mess, but it's an illustrative example of why these things are messes, right? Maybe to just pick one last example, we can move into some other stuff, but the New York Times recently put out that article about Haiti that was going around. And if you haven't read it, I forget the title of it right now, but it's, I don't know, Google New York Times and Haiti, I'm sure you'll find it. It was everywhere. It was like a story about Haiti. Why is Haiti a kind of impoverished nation? And it takes a long historical view. And there are people have said there's all kinds of problems with it, and that is true. But it does rightly contextualize the recent history of Haiti in kind of, against the backdrop of like the interests of the United States, Canada, and France in particular, and also the UN, I guess. And there's a pretty striking revelation in it where I believe it's the French ambassador admits that one motivation for the coup, which he does describe as a coup in Haiti against Aristide in 2004, was that Aristide was asking France to pay back the money that it took from Haiti when Haiti liberated itself in their rebellion, and adjusted for inflation and today's currency and so on, it would have been a lot of money. So Aristide was like, we're poor because all of our like initial kind of finance and economic base was sucked out right away, and then we never recovered, and we want it back. And that was a dangerous thing for France to hear, because guess what? Haiti's not the only place that probably wants money back from France. And so that was like cited as a direct sort of cause of Aristide getting removed in 2004 by a coalition of the US, Canada, France, and the UN. So I think it's just important to kind of recognize that I think because we don't have Ronald Reagan running around doing whatever he's doing in Latin America and things are a little stickier now or something like that, there can be this temptation to assume that imperialism is over, and it's important not to do that, not to assume that.
So we've got China, Venezuela, Haiti, just to name a few examples. I mean, there's a bunch of others that we kind of talk about as well. I mean, Bolivia underwent a coup as well. That was, not organically grown, I would say. So, I mean, there's tons of stuff going on. But I think the point's pretty clear, right? That there is an international order, but it is more like it's more like bullies at a high school lunch table than it is adults doing global politics or something.
We need an adult.
We do need an adult in the world, and it's not the UN, I guess. Maybe the UN is the adult in the world, but the United States is not listening to them, so I guess what does it matter anyways? So there's this sort of like global order that's run by a handful of like countries that do imperialist stuff, and we don't like it. That's all very clear at this point, I think. This is well-trod ground on this podcast. I think it's also worth saying too, though, that in the monthly review article that I was talking about earlier, the question that kind of emerged out of the issue was like, what kind of place does China, or I mean, what kind of place does China kind of hold in the international order of the world now that it's sort of like it has quite a bit of of economic power over like the whole supply chain. Like there's a lot of ways that China exerts power now in ways that it hadn't in the past, right? So a word that people use to kind of talk about this a little bit is the phrase multipolar world, right? And this is an important phrase kind of moving forward because, I mean, it's probably true about China, but it's also true in different ways about other, big countries too. But the idea is that, like, when it comes to imperialism, when it comes to ideas like empire, when it comes to like, this like clique rule, it presumes that there are, a handful of countries that are sort of digging in and crafting the world and the relations of power in such a way that they, can't be toppled, they can't be overturned, no one kind of questioned them, right? And that's kind of, what things look like. That's a unipolar world, a world where the power is held by a small group of people, a small clique. But the concern, I think, of that small clique of people is that there might be another country that becomes increasingly powerful, or that can have some kind of sway, that can kind of question that unipolar position of power. It could swing the world away from, the concentration of power in the hands of a few, and maybe, adding another seat at that table through one way or another towards something called a multipolar world. And the question that I think people on the left, whether they're Christian or not, have to deal with is that good? Is that different than empire? I don't know. It's a great question. Last summer was a different time for sure, and people were, I think, more concerned about China than they are now, as sort of an economic power or something. I guess some people probably are still worried about China, but I think a lot of people have been asking this question about a multipolar world in relationship to Russia, given the Ukraine and whatnot. And I think that's actually a really helpful way to think about the difficulty and like sort of like scariness of maybe the multipolar world. Because, a unipolar world means that power is concentrated in the hands of a handful of people. And, that means that, the power in terms of like real military power, like not just the soft power of, the World Bank or something, which I think is also pretty brutal. But all that to say, like, when a country like Russia invades Ukraine, it demonstrates what might be a multipolar world, but it also shows like the stakes of what a multipolar world is. In the end of this essay from the monthly review I was mentioning a few minutes ago that John Bellamy Foster wrote, he explains though that like the danger of like a Cold War, or the danger of sort of another emerging power in the world that might question the quote unquote rules based order is that like there are material stakes, right? There's no Cold War, he says, without a nuclear arms race to kind of go along with it. And in the case of China, that kind of works out differently because their nuclear arsenal is far smaller than the United States, and there's a whole thing going on there. But I think that is kind of something that's worth bringing up, right? Like with the breakup of like sort of unipolar imperialist power also brings all kinds of like military conflict and sort of scary stuff on that side of things too.
Yeah, I mean that's the big sort of concern, right? Is the loss of power is always threatening. The loss of a monopoly of power is threatening. The other backdrop of the unipolar conversation is the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So you had a kind of struggle between the first and second world, as they said, and then the third world was kind of left to figure it out. But with the second world being at least ideologically broken up with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the assumption was then you'd have this unipolar world led by the United States, which won the contest of ideology. And, they were going to slowly remake the world in a capitalist image and everything would get kind of sorted out. And that has turned out to not be the case because of the economic rise of not just China and Russia, but sometimes they're referred to as the BRICS countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and sometimes South Africa. And the idea is that these are like emerging economies with lots of people, actually more people population-wise, and that means potentially more consumers and more producers, which is a big thing for the economy. If you have more of those two things, you're going to have a bigger economy over time. And so the question is, what does that mean for the position of the U.S. as a unipolar power? Does it mean that it doubles down on all of the ways in which it exerts its power? Does it mean that it relents and tries to find more diplomatic ways of kind of accepting the inevitable and sitting at the table? And I think what you see with like both Trump and Biden is a certain paranoia around the loss of that power. And it's a paranoia that can also get exploited by other bad actors in the world too, right? Like a multipolar world is in some ways advantageous. The US probably shouldn't just have a blank check to do whatever it wants, right? That has turned out to not be a good idea. But at the same time, like it's true that Vladimir Putin is not out there saving the working class and representing a progressive counterbalance in the world or something like that, right? There are people who do like 12-dimensional chess to try to figure out how like the very existence of Russia and Putin is kind of like a magic anti-imperialist position of the world, but the reality is scarier. It's that like a multipolar world is just a huge mess, a huge mess. Mm-hmm. And the unipolar world was also a huge mess. So the question is kind of like, how do we figure out what's the logic underneath that mess? And I think that's where actual talk about imperialism is really helpful, right? Because imperialism involves both like recognizing who holds the keys, which still right now I think is the US, right? They have the most votes at the IMF and the World Bank. They have significant veto power and other kinds of privileges at the United Nations, right? They can really just call the shots. The U.S. dollar is still very strong. So for like the immediate future, that is probably where it's at. But if those kinds of relations shift over time, it's important to try to also figure out, well, what's the logic underneath that kind of motivates like empires struggling with one another. And I think that's at least where the Marxist tradition is really useful because it tries to identify that primarily as a struggle between people trying to accumulate capital and exploit that capital, right? And there's lots of other things going on too. Other interests, nationalist interests, interests around people's perceived values and so on. So it's not just brute economics all the time, I don't think. But at the end of the day, like it's true that when Russia invades Ukraine, there's a lot of economic advantages that come along with that. When the United States invades Iraq, there's a lot of economic advantages that come along with that, right? And trying to figure out how to navigate a multipolar world also necessitates trying to figure out what are the economic logics of something like imperialism.
It's true, and it's also the case too. I mean, we don't need to belabor the point any more than this, I guess, but like there's also economic advantages for the U.S. when Russia invades Ukraine, right? Like it's extremely economically advantageous for arms dealers and all who are going to do a whole lot more business with the United States government now.
Right. And paradoxically too, advantageous for a country like Venezuela, right? Where now the United States is like oh no, we need to,
looking for oil.
we have to talk to them after we tried for several years to stop talking to them. So lots of weird things that kind of happen when empires start arguing.
Yeah. Well, like when it comes to imperialism, I guess something that is really fascinating in the way that people think about it, though, is that like there's this sort of imaginary idea of like what the rules-based order looks like, even on the left. And I mean, I'm sure that people who are secular leftists, I'm sure they fall into this trap too. But I think Christians are particularly bad. Like Christians on the left are particularly bad at this. Like, whenever I think about like Christian writing around imperialism, I always think of, I mean, the word that comes to mind is a word that we've used a handful of times this episode already, and it's empire, right? This is when Christians love to throw this word out to kind of refer to this big sort of like textureless oppressive force in the world that like necessarily is bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, fair enough. But I think you get big end of history vibes from it, right? That that empire is this thing that exists in the world, and we'll use that phrase to critique it, and we'll say that we need to kind of stand against it. But you miss all of the nuance that we've been talking about when you do that, right? The Christians are, I think, good at employing like rhetorically radical phrases like empire and kind of using them to critique the existing order, but they're really bad, I think, at understanding, I mean, maybe like what's actually happening within the systems that create empire in the first place.
Yeah, I think this is also why I guess it's important to this is why it's important to understand like why Venezuela or China or other countries are in the situations they're in particular ways. And again, it's not to necessarily endorse every country that's having a problem or on the wrong side of imperialism or whatever, as we always say what you will about China. But it is to
Right.
say, these things are very complicated. And if you can't figure out how they're complicated, you also are going to have a really hard time figuring out how to resist the ways that empire is conscripting you into its purposes, right? That's the big Christian worry, is that Christians are giving over their faith in Christ or their faithfulness to Christ to a faithfulness to empire. And I think that is a good worry. But
It is totally.
But empire isn't just like a competing idol. Like it's a thing, like weirdly enough, Dorothy Day, who I think I always have a complicated relationship to, she is somebody who I think could kind of thread the needle okay. And I don't know if that comes from like her experience with Marxists and others, but she was a person who I think could recognize there's a spirit of empire, and also the United States wants to destroy Nicaragua, right? Like, it's important to like see those things together and try to figure out why, because that also changes the way that you relate to it. Like, if empire is just a spooky spiritual force that's out there, made up of bad actors being bad people who like don't have the gospel in their heart or whatever, and they're trying to get the gospel out of your heart, then you're always going to necessarily end up on kind of a pious solution, whether it's like organizing the perfect community that you can live in and kind of remain pure, or making sure that you make all the right consumer choices or whatever it might be, or you go to church enough or whatever. But if you think that empire is like, a thing with discernible logic and privileging particular countries, then you might instead organize, a rally in solidarity with the people of Cuba against the blockade of the United States, because you recognize that is a major knock-on effect of imperialism, right? So it's important anyway, I guess, to find a way to square that right Christian concern about how we're getting sucked into some idolatrous relationship or something, with also the material reality of what that idolatry actually commits people to in a real way on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point, because, okay, Christians on the left who write about empire or something along those lines, at least, I think that like they're doing something good. I think it's great to mobilize your faith and like find ways to sort of activate your faith tradition to make you think about the world in a different way. I think that's absolutely great. No argument here. But also there's like a way, though, that sometimes it can be self-defeating. Maybe in a lot of the ways you just said. And anyways, it makes me think of this. There's a theologian named Walter Brueggemann who people know, or they don't know. I don't know. I don't know who people know or not. Anyways, he wrote something called Journey to the Common Good, where he talks a little bit about this like this idea of empire and this way that I think is like both interesting and also problematic in maybe a few different ways. But anyways, he's like in the bit here, he's like talking about the ways that the Israelites, already sort of a difficult thing to kind of jump into, but he's a theologian, I guess. So he's talking about the Israelites and how, you know, they were delivered out of slavery, delivered away from Egypt and from Pharaoh and all this kind of stuff, right? There's like this very liberative story in Exodus, and we all know it and love it, and it's great. But then there's like this interesting turn. This is a thing that I think a lot of sort of Christians on the left point out. And in fact, I think we've done this podcast before. But there's this turn where the people of Israel end up sort of like succumbing to the story of empire, like after having been delivered from it, right? You get it throughout the Old Testament in different ways, with like King Solomon and that whole thing, right? Where the Israelites are telling God, like, we need a king, and God's like, no, you don't. But they still kind of demand a king anyways, right? And Walter Brueggemann is arguing that like there's this thing that happens, or maybe it's like not like a social phenomenon, but there's something that he's kind of locating in the text and drawing it out. That there's this thing that he calls the royal consciousness, where people you know, they for some reason want that, right? You want someone to like sort of rule over you. You want the empire, that kind of thing, right? You're seduced by the idolatry of it, and like there's something interesting about that, I think. And there's, you know, be wary of power is something that my 19-year-old Christian anarchist self would definitely still want to say, and I'm still like here for it. But at the same time, they're like pathologizing the idea of empire to this like extremely spiritual level or something is, to me, seems kind of unhelpful. Or like it just gets in your way of like really understanding what's happening in the world when you're constantly sort of like looking out for your own inner demons about like whether or not you yourself want to take up the royal consciousness of being like the youth group leader or whatever. I don't know. Christians, you know, if nothing else, are extremely good at pathologizing things they ought not to pathologize. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that that there's a sense in which like understanding empire as like a theological category or concept is like sometimes helpful and sometimes powerful, but if you overestimate it, if you over approximate that and like turn it into like an intrusive thought that you have, it becomes very bad. I guess like anything.
Yeah, I think it's also just that's what it comes down to, right? Does the Christian commitment to think through empire as a category, does it deepen your engagement with the material world and like the complexities of it in a way that can really become a motor to engage those, or does it pull you out of them, right? Does it become a substitute for engaging them? And I think that's the big question. Like, for me, I still think there's a lot of value in saying, like, Christianity has this anti-imperialist pulse, right? It centers around all kinds of ancient anti-imperialist themes for sure, but also in a contemporary way, like if you care for the poor or solidarity, you tug on enough threads, you're going to find yourself thinking about big geopolitical problems and trying to figure out, is there something you can do about those, something you can do to help people who are doing something about those, right? But again, if you're kind of like, if your imagination gets too big, if you get lost in the imaginative symbolism of empire, which, you know, there are people whose whole careers are based on that, like big pastors like Brian Zond or whatever, who the kind of shtick is like pointing out that empire, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats are both part of it, and the key is to kind of drop out, right? It's true, like we should drop out of empire, but we should do it in a way that like says how to do that, or like understands how you might do that, and also understands that that's not going to happen in your lifetime in a material way, like you're stuck in it. And I think that's also important too, to then go find maybe Christian voices that do pull those things together. Like, one thing I've learned a lot from liberation theology, I think, is that there are ways of doing this. There are ways of saying there's a spiritual opposition to empire, and that empire too has this kind of spirit to it, right? It's like there's something kind of spooky about it. There's a kind of like negative Holy Ghost thing about it, or something, an Antichrist involved. I think like I get it. It's a vibe and it's real for sure. But that recognition should sort of lead you to identify, well, what are the particular mechanisms that by which that kind of spooky antichrist spirit is reorganizing the world in an evil way, right? That's like when you see like Camilo Torres in Colombia. He's a guy who was also a sociologist and spent a lot of time trying to figure out why is it that Colombia's economy is dependent on the United States, right? Or like people like Juan Segundo doing all kinds of work to figure out like what are the U.S. interests involved in a country like Chile and why. Like it's important to do that kind of more boring work sometimes in order to actually make the Christian commitment make sense in like a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, that's like what I really admire about people like Jim Hodgson,
Yeah.
or, people that do that type of like solidarity work with United Church, or even like development and peace. I mean, the work that you do, Dean, I think is really cool for that reason, because, out of that sense of wanting to resist empire, right. And to not be idolatrous, and to like take the call toward, the social call that Christianity gives you seriously, right. In order to do all of that, like, you have to kind of learn about other people's struggles and kind of figure out the ways that you are complicit for better, for worse than them. I don't know. I mean, I'm not Canadian, for sure. And I'm not Catholic either, but I've seen like the stuff that the development piece has written about mining in other countries and like the ways that it's negatively impacted those communities. And it's like, I have to think like those are struggles like I have to necessarily be involved in, or at least I have to be kind of aware of, because I'm implicated whether I like it or not. So, I mean, at least Christianity gives you that, when it mobilizes the language of empire, it can push you in that direction. And I think that's a good impulse to follow.
Yeah, I think so too. And maybe that's what it comes down to for me anyway. Like, what I've appreciated most about development and peace in particular is what you're pulling out. Like the real kind of root of the way that we work is through those partnerships, relationships with people in other parts of the world who are caring for the poor. And a lot of the mining stuff comes from like partners who are like, okay, you guys live in Canada. One thing that would really help us out is if you could do something about Canadian mining, because that is what is messing us up down here. And, that kind of like really simple relationship leads to then learning all kinds of stuff about like, okay, there's a ton of mining happening in Canada, or like headquartered in Canada. It's all traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Like these are the specific companies, the people who are involved in them. Here's the people actually organizing against them in my city, in my community. So like, I guess I have to go talk to those people, right? Like that kind of initial Christian solidarity or moment of connection leads you to some really complex kinds of organizing, some really complex studying. Like I've learned more about tailing ponds and how the stock market works in Canada than I guess I ever expected to. But it's because like I want to be accountable to those people who are on the other end of empire in a different part of the world, right? Otherwise, like, how can you say in good conscience that you're in solidarity with them? And it requires being committed to figuring out the nitty gritty of all that stuff. So I think like in Canada, mining is one of those big things, right? I think in the U.S., there's lots of other things too. The arms industry, like you were saying earlier, Matt, that's like a huge one. I mean, how do Christians figure out all the interconnections of the arms industry and capital, and how do people resist it? There's a long, proud Christian tradition of resisting that in some pretty important and performative and effective ways. But it takes like being willing to map it all out, to be like, I want to know specifically what the empire is up to so that I can resist it in a meaningful way. I think that is really the only kind of like Christian anti-imperialism or Christian concern about empire that's sort of worth the name.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a lot of Christians out there writing about empire, and good for them. Nothing wrong with that, and they should keep doing it. But I guess it just kind of requires that you take that next step and move past sort of like the prophetic renunciation and towards like the even more prophetic work of organizing people.
Organizing people and reading a lot of books to do it effectively. Thing that bothers me a lot. And some books I love to read, and some books are extremely boring, but I do feel like I have to learn them if I want to like figure out how to make a mining official have a worse day than he would have otherwise.
And that's true. That's what we're after in the end. We just want these mining officials to have a bad day, and for them to stop destroying people's communities. That's it. That's all we're asking for.
That's it. So I guess, at the end of the day, I feel like most people who listen to this podcast probably live in the belly of some kind of empire, right? The US, Canada, the UK. I think those are like the three places most people tune in from, with the occasional folks who are tuning in elsewhere, which, hello, welcome, glad to have you. But those three countries in particular are some of the worst offenders also for being on the side of imperialism. And I think that's the big question is like, what does it mean for Christians living in these countries, thinking about these things, using the tradition of the left, trying to think politically about Christianity? What does it mean for us specifically in the states where we live to like intervene, on particular industries, on particular actions that our states take? That's the big challenge. And I don't know. I don't know how to address it other than to be like, go find a bunch of other people who are trying to do it and like learn all that you can and just show up. That's also maybe a vague appeal to action is probably not like that much of a better substitute than a vague appeal to empire. But I do think that's where it starts. Once you're in the thick of it, then it's easier to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, we got 2 vague appeals now, and that's better than 1, as they say.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can join the Discord community there. If you donate at $2 or more, it's great. It's fun. There's a lot of recipes being shared today specifically, and those have been fun to look at. Lots of neat stuff. We're reading a book about degrowth there pretty soon, I think, and it's good. A lot of good folks. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong. Our outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would else.